I'm rolling.
And in 5, 4, 3, 2. Hello, and welcome back to another exciting episode of DSLR Film Noob Podcast. Devin joins me today to discuss all kinds of stuff. This week we've got some new lenses. We've got some ISO shootouts between the A7S and A7 original. But first, what do you got for me, Devin? Where you been? What have you been doing?
Oh, I've been stuck in this chair, just editing motion graphics like crazy. Just way too much, not enough time, too many client requests. You know how that goes.
Oh man, if you guys have been watching the show live in the video format, you've probably seen me get scruffier and scruffier over the last couple of weeks, and that's because I haven't gone to the barber, haven't really shaved or anything else. This is actually, I'm clean shaven now. I've gotten a haircut. You know, it's no longer out of control up here, and that's because I finished my editing job and I'm back at it again, which is awesome. And also, for those of you listening to this, you may get lower quality audio this week because my field recorder just took a dump on me, and I don't know what's going on with this. So there's that too. But I am glad to be done. I am sorry that you're stuck in the chair, Devin. You got anything else before we move on to the news?
No, let's get straight to the news.
Time for the news. Time for the news. Time for the news.
All right, first thing on the list here is actually the ISO shootout. This is really kind of interesting. This is the Sony a7s versus the Sony a7s Mark II. And there's some great videos over at newsshooter.com. You should definitely check those out. And it basically is comparing the low ISO performance, or excuse me, the high ISO performance in video between the Sony a7s and the Mark II. Both of these cameras use the same sensor, but there's some extra trickery going on in the background that obviously provides a little bit better noise control in high ISO settings. It looks like if you watch the videos, and I don't know if you've seen these yet, Devin, but at 12,800 or so, the A7S Mark II starts to pull ahead in terms of noise performance. Did you take a look at these?
I did, and I think that it's a nice marginal improvement, but it's one of those that almost feels unneeded in general. I mean, I always thought that the A7S kind of did more, performed so well in low light that why would you ever need more? But it's good to see that they're making advances in that department. I think it's just more interesting, the whole 4K part of it. I think that's the part that really makes it worth the price if this is an option that people are considering.
Yeah, it's really strange that there's that much of a difference. Now, I will say, looking at the video in full 100% 1080p and not, scaling in or anything, it's hard to tell the difference. The stuff is really subtle. But when you watch the 400x crop, which, obviously none of us are going to look that close at our 1080p footage unless we're pixel peeking, it doesn't look that bad. 400x crop is where you see the kind of crawliness of the noise. And I kind of wonder, are we losing image resolution? What they're doing in order to control that noise and what's kind of going on in the background? I'm guessing that's on processor noise reduction of some kind, maybe an algorithm or whatever running to produce the better low light performance. Same chip though, so your sensor quality, the image that's coming out of that, it's going to be fairly similar. They've got to do some kind of post processing, right? Yeah, and because I feel like that's the only place that you could take it, is you could do more processing with the sensors, because like we've discussed before, it's the chips, the CPUs that are getting cheaper. And while sensor technology has certainly been chugging along, it hasn't been going nearly as fast as how many gigahertz you can cram inside of your electronics. So it only makes sense that, instead of necessarily focusing so much on an expensive sensor that can give you better low light, you focus on a CPU chip that can turn the image better when shot in low light, like we discussed before with those I don't necessarily want to call them GoPro knockoffs, but those Chinese small action cams that we were talking about that included noise reduction from a CPU area where it was actively doing noise cancellation on the image. So for me though, it's like I said, it's only when you pixel peep, it's only when you really get crazy and you really go in there and dive into it, and it seems irrelevant to me because I've been doing so much pixel peeping with A7S footage, the original and the 2, this past week,
And I'm like, you know what? I feel like I'm spending all this time and learning nothing because it's such a small, minute difference.
Now, the other thing that's really interesting is the A7S and the A7S Mark II both use the Bonsai X processor. So that means that the A7S and the A7S Mark II don't have any real difference in terms of CPU horsepower. That may be incorrect. Bonsai X is a very generic name, so possibly they're using some other flavor of or upgraded version of the CPU, and they're just labeling it as a Bonsai X. This is probably an ARM processor running in the background. But that could also mean that a firmware update to the A7S original could give it the same low light performance as the A7S Mark II. Do you think Sony's just holding back artificially? That was suspected a lot in the 4K internal recording mode as well. Do you think that might be the case with low noise performance?
It's since I didn't design it, I can't say that that's wrong. But for me personally, I feel like there's a lot more that goes on to a board that you put inside of a camera where while maybe the CPU chip is the same or something like that, most of the time things like video shooting is a dedicated H.264 chip, and that's usually why you don't see things like really denoising or anything like that. Usually it's just like a soften tool or some other basic image function that's being performed. So it could be possible that while they're using the same image processor per se, when it's kicking out to H.264, it's going by a different process because it may have a different encoder setup. I mean, after all, it won't be long until they start including dedicated H.265 chips, which will have way more features in the way that it interprets footage before it saves it down to the disk. So I really it's from the spec sheet. You can say these are exactly kind of the same hardware, and theoretically you think it should be possible, but the design and the pipelines and everything else, it's just more sophisticated than that. And I'm not that smart to say if it's one way or the other.
Yeah, there's so many different flavors of ARM chips out there. Sony rebranding something as their own means that it could.
It's really nothing new.
Yeah, anything under the hood, any Cortex A7 or A57 all the way up to A50 or 53 all the way up to A57 could be in there. So hard to say for sure. That's kind of interesting. Go check out those videos. Definitely worth looking at if you are trying to determine which one to buy. I still think the A7S original is probably still the best deal. I think the price is down to $1,650 new.
Yeah, I've been watching those. If you hunt, you can probably find one for $1,500. They pop up on eBay every once in a while, a little used, but looking great nonetheless.
One of the guys I work with is actually trying to talk me into selling the A7S and getting the A7S Mark II. And, I'm looking at this. I'm like, when do we use this? And he's like, well, low light. I'm like, okay. And how often do we need that little bit of extra out of it? It's like, well, we're really impressed with how it shoots. Okay. Are we going to shoot in 4K? Well, no, probably not. Then don't worry about it. I'm going to stick with my A7S and I'm not going to spend the extra money. Plus, this is devalued by $1,000 and some change now. So it's kind of a keeper for me. Definitely not an investment that I need to make in my camera equipment. Although I would say like I Jones for 4K and everything these days, and that is sort of a thing.
Right. And I've never been one about the external recorder. I know a lot of other people are, but you like having pretty minimal gear in terms of what you're carrying around the entire time and running around with. And I'm similar in that department too. I care less about, a second recorder that's doing 10-bit whatever or, super flat profiles than I am about getting my lighting right and getting, the composition right. So,
well, and the other thing I've run into with an external recorder on the A7S is noise at 4K is pretty predominant. I'm guessing, and from the footage I've seen of 4K internal recording on the A7S Mark II, in low light, 4K it still is pretty noisy. The benefit of going to 1080p is really what kind of decreases that noise footprint in your shot. To me, anyway, that's what I've seen in shots on the camera.
And it does other things too. I mean, there's a reason why people, in cinema, because while we talk about punch-in and stuff like that, there's reasons why people who shoot with reds and stuff shoot at 6K. Even though they're going to deliver to 10K, and it's not for punch in, it's for downsampling the footage. because you get rid of so many problems like aliasing and everything else when you take high-res images and you downsample them. You know, we've been doing it in video game and 3D rendering for the longest time now. You know, if anyone does 3D graphics, they know, even though it costs way more time, you get a much better image if you're super sampling or multi-sampling your CGI than if you just do it at the resolution you're going to distribute at. And video kind of falls under the same thing. You know, even though now we're getting spoiled by it. And, you know, originally we were upsampling smaller sensors so that they would, you know, have as many pixels as we need. And now it's kind of the reverse. But I think that's part of the reason why the A7S image looks so detailed, is because of the fact that it's downsampling it, which helps with noise. It helps with aliasing and edges and things like that, and makes a great, sharper and also smoother image, because it's not just all about sharpness.
Now, moving on down the line to some lenses out there. This is actually fairly interesting. I'm kind of excited about this. I know maybe, Devin, you're less excited about lenses because there's a new lens every week. But this is the Sigma 20mm f1.4. It's basically the widest f1.4 available for full frame cameras. This is interesting. $899 is the price tag on this guy. Compare that to the Canon offering, the closest Canon offering, which would be the 24mm f1.4 Mark II. I believe that's $1,500. So this is about half the price, a little bit wider, giving you a better spread if you go 20, 35, 50, and 85. And this kind of rounds out Sigma's line of pretty excellent primes. What do you think about this 20mm f1.4 offering?
It's exciting, even though it's a, you know, what I imagine, because from using the Sigmas before, it's gonna be big because it's full frame, but still 1.4, you can't beat that. You put this up against Canon's line, and I bet you'll probably get 95% of the performance you get compared to like an L series lens, because that's what Sigma's been doing with their lenses for such a long time, is being almost just as good as Canon for like half the price. So it's super exciting to see. I was just looking at prices of L series, and you know, a lot of the 1.4 stuff for their primes is still what, $1,500 for most of it for your mid and telephoto range. So and the fact that they've got a really nice lineup now, I mean, you're right, 20 seems strange. You think they'd go to 18 or something like that since they have a 24, but still you're getting a huge set of beautiful primes here, all at 1.4, and they're all under 1,000. So
there are some positive things and some negative things to this too to think about. In terms of focusing, if you are a focus ring aficionado, these are autofocus lenses, so the focus throw on the ring isn't extremely far, and it does have a little bit of slip, same thing you see on like Canon L series lenses, so keep that in mind. But the positive for Nikon shooters is you finally get to turn your focus ring the correct direction. So if you've been frustrated for years with Nikon shooting and turning your lens the wrong way, it's pretty nice to move into the regular camp. I guess I shouldn't say the right way or the wrong way. I should say the Nikon or the Canon way.
You're going to start upsetting people.
Yeah, no offense to anybody who feels that the Nikon direction you turn your focus ring is the correct one. That's fine, whatever. But this is a nice setup, and you know, having what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lenses that under $5,000, it's a pretty attractive offer. Now, I will say they haven't updated the 85mm f1.4 yet. That's still sitting on the previous generation, and the 85 f1.4 original, as well as the pre-art series 50mm f1.4, both did suffer on some Canon bodies from focus drift. So keep that in mind. It was also, I think some of them were reporting back focus and some were reporting front focus. I don't know which is the more common problem to have with those, but I know the 51.4 original before the art series has been on sale all over the place for like $450 to $500, and the 85mm f1.4, $800 used, $700 used. I see that all the time, and I think it's normally about $949. So those are two bargain lenses, but AF is not as good. The other thing to note on these art lenses, and some of you are probably already familiar with this, but Sigma has a really nice USB programming kit for these lenses. So if you're really trying to dial in your AF with these lenses, you can plug it into that and make micro adjustments to the focus depth in order to kind of get those into line with whatever you're shooting on. So that's kind of interesting feature. Is there other cameras that do that? I can't think of any manual or user changeable lenses like that.
The only thing I've seen is usually the adapters, things like Metabones and stuff like that. Even the older Sigmas that didn't include the USB port are still completely programmable. You just need an adapter. But a few months ago, I was at a local photography, videography shop, and they had a Sigma rep there that had the adapter. And it's like, you can bring in your lenses for free. We'll upgrade it to the new firmware and help you set up your lens and stuff like that. So sometimes you don't even need to buy an adapter. If you have an older Sigma that doesn't have the USB port, sometimes your local photography shop will have the adapter and do it for free. Because Sigma is pushing really hard on customer satisfaction.
Yeah, and they've got some nice stuff coming out. Now that I was thinking about it, there is actually one other group of lenses I know that have firmware updates, and that's Panasonic glass. If you go to the Panasonic website, you can actually download the camera firmware as well as the lens firmware and add that to your card and then update the firmware for your lens via the camera, which is kind of a
nice solution. Well, and it's nice because updating the data on it, I think mainly the reason why they update firmware isn't so much to fix focusing problems or anything like that, like Sigma might be doing. I think it's mostly just to make it communicate better and faster with, something new. Because I saw a bunch of those lens updates come out when the GH4 came out, and a recommendation that if you're using this old Lumix glass, which I mean isn't that old, but still, you could have bought it years before the GH4 came out, you should update this lens, which you could do through your GH4, which is just a nice, product, a way of doing it is like, hey, if you have our Panasonic camera, you can use that to upgrade your Panasonic glass. I think a lot of the times it's to try to prevent problems, and it's to work better with the newer hardware, which may kind of, maybe pull at a different rate in terms of where the focus is or something like that, because they're trying to make things faster. So it's a way of making sure that everything works smoothly is mostly the reason why I find updating firmware for a lot of this stuff, as opposed to other stuff like Metabones, where it's actually translating that data in between like a Canon piece of glass and maybe, Panasonic. That I feel like those firmware updates are because like they're improving their like algorithms or whatever they're doing, their formulas
and so on.
Yeah, adding Canon lens support and everything else. So that's much more critical. And I think that's why from the get-go, those have included little USB ports for you to sit there and program them. But yeah, it's good to see that, because if you're going to have a lens that is electronically driven like this, where it is a virtual focus ring, you'd want to hope that you'd be able to keep that updated and keep it working with all your newest lenses, as opposed to, Canon, where they've done it one way forever. And so if you've bought a Canon lens, it's just going to work on every single Canon camera, because Canon refuses to change any of that stuff. So, also too, these Sigmas would work great on an a7s. If you have problems with low light, you could go ahead and throw one of these on and shoot at 1.4. Then you don't have a problem with low light.
I think most of these are only available in A mount. I don't know if any of them are available in E mount yet.
Just adapt it. Get the Nikon F and just adapt it.
Okay, so I've got the A mount to E mount adapter on my A7S, and I do use A mount lenses. But it looks like, and that's actually a good point, I didn't put it in the show notes, but if you've noticed, there hasn't been a new A mount Sony camera to be announced or released in the last year and a half. So it looks like they may be abandoning the A mount line and moving strictly to the E mount, because how many cameras have we seen in the E mount line in the last, year and a half? They've basically done 3 cameras last year and then another 3 cameras this year. That's a fairly aggressive model. And then the other camera lines have kind of just been wasting away. I feel like eventually we're going to see really good lens selection for E mount lenses. It's just going to take quite some time for them to catch up, since they were sort of focused on like the A77 and those other series of cameras.
I'm not sure about that, because a lot of market share has been going towards the mirrorless market, and not that Sony wouldn't continue that line because they've already have money invested into it, but in terms of innovation and pushing things forward, I wouldn't be surprised if they pull most of their R&D and their development funds over to the mirrorless sector, because the mirrorless sector right now is growing in popularity. People love the smaller size, and the fact that they've done a mirrorless that's full frame, right now they're the kings of that market, and I'm sure they want to keep that way, because nobody else is touching that, because Panasonic is sticking with the open standard of micro four thirds, and Canon's come up with their own mount, but they don't put enough behind it that a lot of people are really going crazy for it, as we've discussed every time that pops up in the news. So I wouldn't be surprised if like Sony's neglecting it on purpose, being like, it's not that important. Not a lot of people are screaming for it. Everyone right now, their eyes are glazed over by how great our, A7 line is. So, why don't we stick to that?
Yeah, as soon as they fix the AF system, then I will scream from the rooftops. Anyway, the Sigma lenses, they're a great selection. If you're in the market and you're slowly starting to move your lens lineup up to some really good primes, definitely something to check out. They are all autofocus, so if you're using for photography / video, they're probably a good option. Might even be a better investment than going with some of the Rokinon lenses or some of the manual focus lenses out there if you are planning on doing both photography and video. At the prices they're at right now, man, I wish these were available when I started out. I wouldn't own nearly as much L glass as I do. Yeah,
right. Well, at least your L glass is still worth something, but the Sigmas have come in so cheap that I don't imagine they're going to get any cheaper for a very long time. As opposed to, we were just talking about before the podcast that the Lumix glass now, you pull for half the price. I remember when their 12 to 35 was $1,000 around, $1,100, and now just about everyone is selling brand new for $650, $670, which is a huge decrease, and their telephoto version is only $100 more than that. So right now is a good time probably to buy Lumix glass as opposed to 2 years ago, but the Canon has maintained its value. And I feel like these Sigmas too are going to maintain their value almost because they can't be sold any cheaper. The Canon, on the other hand, refused to be sold any cheaper. So that's why they maintain their value. So it's slightly different. Not saying that Canon doesn't, have fantastic glass or whatever, but
Canon kind of undercuts themselves. Like my value of some of my lenses, I have the 35mm f1.4 original, which is, even though it's an L series lens, it's a plastic, plastic, not water sealed. It's not the best quality L series lens.
It brings shame to the L series name.
Yeah, exactly. And they release a Mark II. Now my 35mm f1.4 is worth quite a bit less than it used to be. It's dropped like $400 in value because there's a brand new fancier one out. Same with the 24 to 70 f2.8. That lens, the original, was pretty valuable right up until they released the Mark II, and then bam, the price fell off. And I take advantage of that too, because I have several ultra wide angle lenses because I like that form factor on my 5D Mark IIIs. And I have the 17 to 35 as well as the 35 or 16 to 35. And the 17 to 35 was what was replaced by the 16 to 35. And you can pick that up for, I think, $500, $400 used, because it's so far down the L series lines. I think they stopped making it in like 99 or 2001, something like that. So it goes away.
True. There's some other lenses, but I mean, those gigantic 400mm white body ones, those they're always very, very expensive. I feel like
my 7200 IS still maintains like a good $1,200 to $1,500 street price. So definitely not something that's going to drop too far down the line. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
All right, moving on down the line to some apps. This is kind of interesting here, and we've got a couple of them to talk about. This first one here, and I'll share my screen for those of you watching this, is actually for Panasonic cameras. And we've kind of heard this whole like multi-focus point shooting, bracket focusing, I think is what they're calling it, be available for the GX8. Now, it looks like you can pretty much do that with any of Panasonic's camera, provided you get into the web controller app and you change the focus point via the lens controller on the camera. So what this clever app does is actually goes through, grabs a focus point, moves the lens a little bit, takes another shot, gets the focus point, so on and so forth, and then combines all those back together so that you get bracket focusing in a nice little app. The image results, I've got some links in the show notes. They look pretty decent.
They look
not really not effect I'm into per se, but I could see it being really valuable for like macro photography, where you don't just want the head of the fly in focus. And I think there's a fly picture in here somewhere. Yeah, right here. You can actually get the entire leaf. And this one right here, he's got a little note that says it was 246 images combined to create this focus range that's available here. And they look really cool.
No, and it's a good point because, maybe people don't look that often at macro photography, but macro photography is like usually a millimeter of focus. And here you're getting entire insects and entire flowers and things like that in focus. So it definitely, provides a whole different way to shoot your macro photography. I mean, they're around the edges. It's not perfect, the solution of stacking these photos together and trying to bring all the detail out of it isn't perfected yet, I'd say, but still, it's really cool to see. I think it definitely works, especially if you're trying to do a miniature effect or anything like that. So I'm kind of excited to see it because I enjoy macro photography from time to time. And I know that most of the time when I shoot, it's like, oh, let's get the bee's head in focus because that's all that we can get in focus when you're doing macro photography, as opposed to like the entire body and stuff like that, especially if you're trying to fight light.
Yeah, you really need a pretty strong light source if you're stopping down to f16 to take a picture of something like that. So it is really interesting application. It's cool to see that this can be done in an app as well as in camera. Now, this app, I've got links to in the show notes. If you guys want to check it out, it's there. The example pictures are there as well. I believe it's 99 cents, fairly reasonable for an experimental thing to play around with. Not 100% sure what you would do as a post workflow if you were trying to stack focus bracketing in post. There's probably some apps out there. If anybody knows anything about that, send us an email because I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. Interested to know what you would use as a workflow for that. Now, the other app I kind of want to talk about here, and I've actually got a screen of this up, and this is called Polarr. I was going to add it to the pick of the day, but I think it's better time to talk about it right now. If you look at this app right here, this is a free photo editing app. And I know we normally talk about video stuff, but
it looks
what do
gorgeous.
you really need in a photo editing app? This is just a goofy picture of me, but you need a little bit of color correction. You need to be able to handle raw images. Right now, I'm playing around with a DNG file from the Panasonic LX100. You can change your color temperature, do that sort of thing. You've got vibrance controls as well as your curves for making subtle adjustments. You know, all the regular things that you need to adjust, including brightness, exposure, highlights, shadows, black balance, whites.
Basically, the entire Lightroom panel.
Yeah, everything
that is like
need.
Verbatim about the Lightroom panel, like highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. All that kind of stuff is like right on there.
And that's the thing. So this is not just a like toy app that you get on your phone that allows you to do a few little things. This is pretty much everything you would need to do basic editing. You know, saturation with color selection. So like if I wanted to make the blues really pop and be super saturated, you know, those options are all here. And this is free for Chrome OS, as well as an extension for Chrome browser. And this I'm using in Google Launcher right now. That's free. And for $15, you can also get it in the Windows Store. So not very expensive.
What's its raw support like?
Raw support, I've only tested it out with Canon RAW files and DNG files. Unfortunately, since I convert all my RAW files to DNG, I didn't have a ton laying around in other formats. So,
but still, like
you might
the
be missing out on
raw. The fact that it'll process a raw file, we're talking about like, you know, something that runs inside of your browser that is doing like actual raw editing.
Well, and the other thing is the footprint is super small. Lightroom's around 200 megs or so to install, maybe 300 megs. This is 2.5 megs on the install. So super tiny. The import and export features aren't all quite there. It's you know, it's a very simple layout for bringing in pictures and exporting them. But you have all the basics, everything you need. Like I could see if you're just editing, you know, some basic photos for maybe a blog post, for example, or you were doing some quick edits for a friend, you take pictures of their daughter or something like that. Probably not a professional workflow because you still need a few of the awesome dehaze filters and things like that that are available in Lightroom. But man, this is just about everything for amateur up to like low budget pro level photo editing without spending any money at all.
I'd say pro level as well, because I know some photographers who they don't do much more than that to their photos. Either they don't have a need to because they shoot it right the first time, or because they simply, you know, just don't have they don't know how to. And for their clients, for whatever reason, they don't really care about maybe something that is absolutely perfect or something that has more of an artistic expression. So I think that, you know, I could even see necessarily pros using this because, hey, it's easy, it's free, and it does 90% of what I need it to do. And you know, it's like the Photoshop argument. Like you can get great tools that become very close to what Photoshop is capable of, and some of those are even free. And yet, you know, everyone gets Photoshop because that's what you're told you're supposed to get. But is it really necessary? I think for a lot of people doing a lot of photography that are doing basic cleanup and stuff like that, things like Photoshop and all the advanced tools is something that they'll never necessarily learn to use. So what's the point on spending the money on unless you're really going to use all those added features?
Yeah, I'm really surprised at how good this is. I've only been playing around with it for a day, but it brings to mind a Chromebook as possibly a tool I could take with me on vacation and get, 11 hours of battery life and do some basic photo editing and then upload it to Google Drive or something like that.
Well, and because I love Chromebooks, and I would love to have an excuse to use a Chromebook in production. But besides office work, Chromebooks have just been lacking in development, not necessarily lacking in power, because you can buy Chromebooks with i5s and all kinds of stuff. Not that you'd video edit on anything that costs $300, at least not comfortably, but still, the amazing battery life of being able to sit there and work away for 8 to 10 hours straight. Like, I'm fascinated by that nothing else is able to hit that. And I love the laptop form factor. I know that like tablets have been a really big thing. And now I feel like they're kind of dying off a bit because people are going back to like keyboards being like, well, I really need to do work. It's one thing if I want to consume media, but if I want to create, I need a keyboard. And Chromebooks are like small size, couple $100. It'll last you all day, and you can type scripts all day. There's web apps for typing up scripts and everything else. And I think too, when they bring in Android support for their apps, it's going to totally blow up the Chromebook market. But they're still, I don't know why they're taking so long. I don't know what's the difficulty with that, but I think they're working hard on bringing apps over to that. That's totally going to be a game changer. And while you may not still do video editing, like you said,
wait, you just said game changer, man.
Did I say game changer?
You said game changer. No game changers. Never the game changer.
Never the game changer. But like you said, if you go on vacation, you can take a Chromebook with you, which is small, light, and would last you an entire day. And you can just, use that to sit here and do basic editing of photos, upload, as well as, doing your basic answering emails or anything else. Or you could sit on, a plane for a couple of hours and get some work done. So I super enjoy it. And like I said, I'm always finding an excuse to try to get a Chromebook or two into my workflow. It's just one of those that it doesn't have the development and the apps for it. And I think that the answer to that is, bring those Android apps over, because there's a lot of great Android apps that work on tablets that do great things. And even some that are compatible with like plugging into your Canon camera to use as a viewfinder or whatever. So I'd love to see that stuff move over.
Now, taking a page out of your book here and talking about tablets for a second, and this wasn't in the show notes either, but it's definitely something I'm interested in. Have you seen the Surface Book? Because, yes. Oh my gosh, man, that thing is super sexy. Dedicated GPU in the keyboard with extra battery power, full, Wacom integration into the touch screen so that you can actually draw, imagine doing rotoscope with a pen as opposed to a mouse. Oh man. That is some sexy stuff. And the price is less sexy. I mean, I guess you bought a MacBook Pro before, you're used to this, $3,199 for the 1 terabyte version. But man, right? Does this thing look nice, right? What do you think, Devin?
It's a very ideal production tool because what's the i7 it has in there?
I want to say it's the HQ 4710, or maybe it's a 4790, but I can't,
but if it's probably like a 5200 HQ, but still, something like that is on par in terms of performance with what I currently edit with, which sounds silly, but my 2600K that I edit with handles some 4K footage. It handles HD footage just fine, multiple streams, everything else. With SSD storage especially, I mean, it's really expensive, but it's also what you potentially say like one of the ultimate production tools, because you do have like the Wacom there for, doing, like you said, rotoscoping or even messing around in Photoshop or drawing masks. And then at the same time, you get the portability factor. You get a great, physical keyboard, which I'm always about because I'm way faster than anyone else on a physical keyboard. So it's one of those things that that is like, man, way too expensive for me, but that would be a cool tool to have, in your backpack.
Oh man. And then the choice to go just to a tablet or to a keyboard and tablet is really nice. A lot of times, when you grab your laptop, you are not doing it because you're grabbing it to do production work. You're grabbing your laptop because you want to head down to the bar and like check your emails and take care of a few things, or you're heading down to the coffee shop to, you know, just browse around a little bit and look for something on Craigslist. And then when you needed to get down and do some serious editing, you want your full laptop. And right now I have a tiny little ASUS 13-inch laptop for the, you know, mundane stuff of like surfing the internet and looking for things. And then I have a separate MSI GS60 4K monitor, crazy 15-inch form factor, GTX 970 GPU shoved into that thing. And it sounds like a rocket when it's taken off, but it has all the power in the world, and that's great. But what if you had both? Now, and that's sort of the proposition you're getting out of the Surface Book is it's a GTX 970 OEM flavored GPU crammed in the keyboard. So you basically have a very high rendering rates with your, you know, CUDA processing and everything in the, or Mercury playback engine in this. Oh man, I would trade both my laptops just to have this guy, so I could, you know, split things off and, you know, run off of the i7 processor's onboard graphics card when I'm using my tablet, and then work on the whole system and still have the convenient, nice form factor of both the tablet for drawing or for editing, you know, certain types of graphic interfaces. You know, Photoshop has really good pen integration, for example, and then going back to a full keyboard layout, because honestly, I want my space bar, I want my C command, my V command, and all those other things for editing video, you know, and that's perfect. This would be awesome. I like that we're seeing a ton of these detachable screen form factor systems with like extra stuff. Now there's some other weird stuff in here, and this isn't a show about laptops, but definitely look into it if you're an editor and you have $3,000 to spend on a laptop. This isn't perfect. There are definitely some dedicated, you know, 4 to 8 pound laptops that do have way more power under the hood than this thing does. But man, sometimes you trade style and sexiness for you know, power and performance. And if it's the right trade-off, then it might be worth it.
Oh, absolutely. And it's one of those that, like you said, if you compare it that way, you know, the price of 2 tools and you're combining those 2 tools into one, the price almost pretends to start making more sense. But still, it's like right now the ultimate thing you can get if you're going to do some light editing, even some light motion graphics on the go, and you also want that like easy to carry light tablet like experience and stuff like that at the same time. It really makes it an ideal tool for you know, those of us who need to work on the go.
Oh man, I want a stylus. I want a drawing tablet. I just have never had the justification to throw it into my bag. All right, moving on down the line. This is kind of interesting, and this is from DP Review, actually. It's a quick post comparing the DxO Mark scores for both the GX8 as well as the Olympus E-M5 Mk2. The E-M5 Mk2 was the original leader in the DxO Mark scores for image quality straight out of the camera in Micro Four Thirds format. Looks like the GX8 is beating it by just a hair, but it is an improvement. Now the GX8 does cram in I believe a 20 megapixel sensor, whereas the OMD E-M5 Mk2 has the 16 megapixel sensor. I suspect the same as the GH4 and so on. What do you think about this, Devin? Is that going to make you run out and get the GX8?
No, I think this is just pixel peeping. I mean, if you haven't pulled the trigger yet on a, you know, an M5 Mark II, then this would give you something to consider. But for me, it's one of those that, like, yeah, it's down to like pixel peeping again. Like, yeah, if you really concentrate hard, both of these produce beautiful images. And I think form factor, how it feels in your hand, where the controls are, how easy it is to use in this case, along with price, is much more important than like these little marginal improvements. I mean, the 22 megapixel, I guess that's important for some people. I'm still not the person who's taking photos for print, and I still don't know of a lot of people who are using mirrorless to take photos for print. I mean, I know they're out there. I'm just saying I haven't run into them myself, because I think they're few and far between. But in this situation, it's like both of these would well surpass whatever I'm thinking about in terms of photography to get, great looking images. They're both really great at what they do. They're a really small size. And so then it's one of those where I'd want to rent it and try it out and see, hey, how does the form factor go? Because the Panasonic menus have been pretty good, and their layouts for the GH3, GH4, and also the G7 and stuff like that. I really like their layouts. I really like how they plan everything out. So it's one of those where I think that's where it comes down to, and not so much like, oh, I read a stat sheet and, this beat out the Mark II by, half a bit depth of color. I'm like, I'm not going to notice that in my photos. It's not going to really seem all that important. So to each their own. But for me, it's not necessarily exciting. It's just one of those things to consider if this is kind of the camera you're looking for.
One of the interesting things is actually to see the low light performance. If you notice down here at the bottom, the low light performance and the on the GX8 is around 806 ISO, and the low light performance on the E-M5 Mk2 is around 896. You think that's just a representation of the cramming more pixels onto the same size Micro Four Thirds sensor?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're increasing megapixel bore and not increasing sensor size. This is one of the reasons why you remember long ago with the iPhone 3G.
Holy cow, man. Going
right?
back to like 2011.
Right. And for a while, because I was a novice and I knew nothing, I would brag about how I think then it was like a Windows Mobile 6 phone I had. My Windows Mobile 6 phone had like 3.2 megapixels or something like that. And my buddy's iPhone had 1.3 megapixel. And everyone complained about how there was so few megapixels in the iPhone. And then I noticed as we took photos, all of his low light photos looked really good. And mine looked really garbage. I mean, at the time, they were both grainy photos, but at least you could see what was going on in his photos. And part of that reason is because they weren't pushing megapixels in order to keep good performance in low light, which, let's face it, most cell phones are fighting low light because they're tiny sensors, and they're usually not a camera you're using, or you're always using with available light. So low light performance is really important in those kind of cameras. And that's something that I always remembered as being like, yeah, megapixels isn't everything. You cram more megapixels in there, but you don't increase the sensor size, you're going to run into problems trying to get all that light out of that image. So it's probably directly related to the two. I mean, it looks like from the numbers and from some of the photos that they're pretty much still the same. It's not like I could look at the two photos like you can with an a7s and a G4 and be like, oh, this low light was the a7s. It's not that dynamic. But, if you want an edge in that department, then that would be the camera to go for. But like I said, in terms of how close these are, I'd way prioritize usability. How does it feel in my hand? Are all the controls immediately in front of me? Does this work the way I like to work? Because you take, like Sony and their absolutely horrific, terrible menu system. It's like that makes it a real hassle to use. So, for me, I'm like, a Sony camera has to have really good features for me to want to suffer through its interface system.
Yeah, the form factor is actually a pretty big deal. Like the GH4, and that's what I kind of wonder. I haven't messed around with the GX8 yet. The GH4 has kind of the full size hand grip, which even for someone with large hands like me feels pretty good to hold on to and to shoot with. The GX8 is sort of got that weird flat shape. It's sort of a rangefinder look, which is cool looking. But in practical use, is that going to be very comfortable to hold on to? It also appears to be a tad bit taller than the GH4 in side-by-side shots that I've seen. So I don't know. I like the idea of the GX8, but
I think part of that design scheme is that it's a thought process about how the camera is being used. I'm not a designer, so take this with a grain of salt, but I feel like things like the GH3 and GH4 were built to be held constantly throughout the day. Whether you're doing photography or doing video, it's kind of made for that pro market. Something like the GX8, I feel like, is aimed at the hobbyist, where they're going to walk around all day with a camera strapped around their neck, and they're going to pick it up and take a few photos here or there, and they're not going to be holding on to it the entire day. Those people more care about the size. Some of them care about the look of the camera. But all in all, it's one of those things where you notice that design. And it's the same thing with the Canons. They don't give something like the Rebel a huge grip because they're trying to make it small, and it's not necessarily targeted at the pro market. It's targeted at the enthusiast market, where something like a 70 or goodness, even a 5D, you know, first off, they have to build a bigger camera, but also too, they put a big, nice grip on it so that you can hold it all day and not get fatigued from it. What I really love about the GH3 and GH4 form factor is that while it makes it slightly bigger, and DJ hates that, if you put the bottom grip on it, which you can find them for $50 if you find some kind of knockoff of it. I think it's like $150 if you buy the Panasonic one, but that bottom grip actually provides a small support for your pinky, and it just balances the camera perfectly. And even though I rarely use necessarily the vertical grip, if I'm going to be out all day doing photos, I'll usually put the vertical grip on just because I feel like it just makes the camera slightly longer, so my whole hand can fit it perfectly. But to each their own.
Side note about the vertical grip is actually an issue that I ran into. And after this happened to me, I refused to ever use the vertical grip for any kind of video shooting at all. We were shooting on a 5D Mark III, and both cameras had grips on there because I was tired of changing out batteries. And I was like, oh yeah, I'll just put a grip on and then that's fine. I'll get more battery life, no problem. Well, one of the cameras started developing this weird purple line in the video footage, and it would come on and then go off, and then come on and go off. And I was like, oh man, something's busted in the camera. We were shooting in like a foggy, kind of stormy area, and
so it's really obvious.
Yeah, I was putting the camera through some sort of rougher terrain and some rougher treatment, and I was like, oh man, I busted my 5D Mark III. We're gonna have to shoot on this camera. And somebody walks over and they're like, why do you have grips on there? I'm like, well, because I needed more battery. And they're like, well, why don't you take them off? Those suck. I hate grips. And then they told me the same story. They're like, I had problems with my camera years ago and I never use a grip. It's bull crap. You know, don't use a grip. Well, so we took the grip off, threw the battery in, no problem with the camera. It turns out that the terminal lugs on the grip, because they're spring loaded and push up against there, they were just not making good enough contact, and it was under voltaging the camera, but not enough to completely drop it out. It was just enough to cause like weird errors to happen while we were using the camera. So after that happened to me, absolutely no grips whatsoever on cameras while shooting. I would rather have a cutout plate and have to change them out on a regular basis than deal with that sort of mess again, or use a dummy battery and terminal it back to something that's proper, like a V-Lock or an Anton Bauer.
Sure. In defense against Panasonic is that it's one of the few battery grips where you keep the battery in the camera as well as adding an additional battery to the grip, as opposed to, I know a lot of the Canons are you put both batteries in the grip and then put the grip puts a dummy battery in. So to each their own, but for me, I kind of love the feel of it. And like I said, only when I'm doing photography. When I'm doing video, there's usually a bit of rigging, audio gear, and crap like that. So it's kind of pointless because there's so much other stuff going on. But if I'm doing walk-around photography or something like that, I really enjoy having it, even though I rarely, maybe use it vertically. Just the fact that it makes it a little bit chunkier and makes it a little bit easier to hold, because I hate camera straps. And I may be in the minority, but I don't like having camera straps on.
One of the things that Devin was talking about, and this is actually a fairly interesting design choice, and here's my GH4. If you look at the bottom right here, these pins are actually where the battery grip brings the power into the camera itself. Also, the same terminals that they use in order to interface that XLR/SDI output system. So then the terminal itself is sort of your power point, and the battery compartment continues to stay the same. Interesting way to do it. Canon's actually goes directly into the battery compartment itself, and it's kind of hokey design. Now, I will admit, I was using some lower priced grips on there, so possibly Canon's actual name brand grips might be better than the ones I used. But Devin's grabbing something right now.
Again, apologies to people who are doing the audio version of the podcast. But here I'm holding up the bottom grip. And as I was pointing out, if you see, when I grip my hand on it, my pinky actually falls right on that lower grip. And it just makes this nice cubby hole. And it's just so much more secure. And I love the way that it works, as well as the vertical grip too, because it's longer. It's much easier to hold that way too. So I actually really enjoy having that bottom grip on there. Like I said, this one I actually got isn't officially Panasonic. You can kind of tell by the buttons have already started to wear out. You can't read white balance anymore or anything like that. And a lot of the scrolling pieces don't have any soft touch to them. They're cheap and plastic. But for what I need, it works fine because it gives me an added battery. One thing that people complained about, though, was that it screws up your quarter 20 on the bottom. Instead of it being in the middle, it actually shifts it over. For about 25 bucks on eBay, there's people who make 3D printed plates that'll shift that back into the middle for you. It adds a little bit of height, but still, I enjoy it. And on the Panasonic, I've never had a problem, even though I'm using an off-brand. You know, and I think it gives me that perfect grip that I'm looking for. And like I said, for me, it's usability. It's how easy it is to grip and use the camera, and I can carry this all day without a care in the world. As opposed to something like the GX8, I imagine I'd get pretty fatigued and worried about dropping it after a while.
Yeah, that's a good point, man. I guess like your form factor depends on your hand size and everything else too. With Devin and I both, again, big mitts. My wife prefers little tiny cameras. She really loves my LX100 for that reason, because it's such a cute little petite thing. Now, moving on down the line here, we've kind of gone into that rat hole a little bit. I got two more things to cover before we get out of here. And first is actually Lightroom. We talked earlier last week about Lightroom coming out with an update 6.2 that basically screwed up all of your import options and
screwed up everything.
Yeah, not everything, but they definitely took away a lot of the features that were available for importing images. One that's really handy is the eject card when complete, and some of the convert options as well.
They angered the masses. There were pitchforks and flaming torches outside the gates of Adobe.
And this article up on petapixel.com, there's a link on it in the show notes. Basically, they are talking about how Adobe is caved. Adobe has decided that they are going to go ahead and bring back all those features. So if you did download and install 6.2, I believe is the version, you can restore back to 6.1.1 and get those features back until the new version comes out, I think, at the beginning of next month. They also introduced a number of bugs with the 6.2 update, which were causing crash issues, as well as the cache file reading. So if you're editing images on the fly and you have, say, an SSD with 20 gigs of a photo cache available for you to work off of, like I do, then you will get multiple crashes. Trick 2 also is just clear your cache and let it rebuild, and then you'll be good to go. But pain in the butt regardless. So thanks, Adobe, for listening to everybody complain at you. This is probably one of the first big screw-ups Adobe's made in quite some time. When's the last time they screwed up like this?
Adobe's been making people happy, and I've been using Adobe probably since CS3, roughly. So I'm not that old, but still. It's one of those where I've noticed that since probably CS6, Creative Cloud, Adobe's been kind of crashing more and more in terms of Premiere and After Effects. And it's never been enough, I think, that's caused any alarm for anybody else, but they've been adding new features, and they still have been improving stability. I feel like the newest version of Creative Cloud is probably the most stable I've had it since CS6, which I'm absolutely thrilled with.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it has something to do with my workflow, the workflow that we had at the station and stuff like that. But when we upgraded from CS6 to Creative Cloud in 2014, there was just a lot of sporadic crashes and things that just didn't seem to work well. And 2015 seems to be super stable. I actually haven't had a crash on it yet, so on my home machine. So I've been happy in all that department. But you're right, like, Adobe's just been adding features, and a lot of what they've been doing is listening to how people use their software. And I don't know what happened with Lightroom. It's like maybe they're like, oh, well, only 1% use these features, so it shouldn't be that big of a deal for us to drop it. And then the 1% got super loud, and I think even the people who aren't the 1% joined on the bandwagon to start, trying to light the Church of Adobe on fire. So everything went downhill from there. So of course Adobe's going to reverse it, because they really upset the masses with all the changes that they made. And so but I can understand why they're doing it, because it costs money every time they try to update that, like make that compatible with Windows 10 and everything else. Like, that costs time to include all those features. And so I think from a business standpoint, they're starting to reach the point where they go, we got too much going on because we're trying to support too many different kind of workflows. We need to pull back and start channeling people into like kind of one or two proper workflows. I think that's what they're trying to do here. And it kind of went all wrong and squirrely, because everyone wants things their way. So,
well, one of the big issues actually is they use statistical monitoring on the usage. So if they see something that a large group or a majority of the users are not using, then they will sunset that particular application. So in the case of this, and Adobe even brought this out in their original announcement, they're like, hey, statistically speaking, only like 3 or 4% of the people actually even mess around with these features. Most of them don't even know it exists. And I think you and I actually had a conversation about Lightroom months and months ago, and I was like, you could just convert to DNG on the fly, and you're like, what? I'm like, that little line up at the top, man, you just click DNG and it auto converts, and you're like, I didn't even know that was there. And it's, it's up there, but like, that's the kind of thing that you get into where you don't use a feature, so you don't even worry about it. And After Effects, as well as Premiere Pro, they all have those sorts of things like hidden deep down in the menus. For the longest time, I would use for audio, if I recorded a 2-channel setup, I would use fill right and fill left and copy the clips. I didn't even realize that when you right click on there, there's an audio selector option that you can click on in Premiere Pro that allows you to simply mono each of those channels on the same clip so that you don't have to duplicate the work in order to get both of them in left and right channels. And it's stuff like that, I'd been doing it all day, and then I stumbled across this. I'm like, I've been doing this wrong for like 5 years, and this feature's probably been available, and I didn't know about it. And that's the other thing. Like, they need to come up with a better way than the tip of the day to tell us about these new features. Because, you go to Adobe site and they'll have like 40 Adobe evangelists that are like, hey, here's the greatest thing that we've got here, and here's this other thing. And you see, you're like, ooh, that looks really sweet. Like when they introduced the puppet tool, for example. But then forget about it. You don't really do anything with it, and then you're trying to figure out how to use it, trying to figure out how to implement it. Maybe it uses some sort of Mocha tracking system or something else that you're not familiar with, and you're trying to figure out what it does. They ought to have something that like basically goes into a tutorial format with Premiere Pro. And yes, I know, guys, there are Premiere Pro tutorials for everything online and available from Adobe as well as other places. But maybe like, when you install Chrome for the first time and it gives you a little like highlight window that says, here's this, click on it. Here's this is what it does. Here's this. And I know that's super dumbed down and easy, but man, I would love to be like, okay, I need to use this warp stabilization system. Like there's 20 settings. What the hell is this like last one down here at the bottom do? I don't even know what that means. Like,
there's no bigger example of this than with After Effects, because After Effects has so many effects that can be used in different ways. I was watching a free tutorial on how to do those very long 2D shadows for objects that like extend past the video frame, like the composition. Just stylistically, I was trying to find a few different ways to do it, try to figure out what works best for me. And one of them was the guy just used a giant blur that blurred it across and then did a matte choke, but did it negative on the matte choke. So instead of choking it, it actually expanded it and then gave it hard edges. And so there's all these little effects that like, even if you try playing with it, you won't really learn any good ways of using it unless you come into a situation where like this is the best way to use it. And then same thing too, there's an effect I didn't even know called the something composition or whatever. But basically what it does is if you take your, like, let's say you blur out your text, you can't read the text anymore, but you put this effect on the very bottom and it takes whatever the original thing was before all of your effects and throws it back on top. So you don't have to do 2 layers if you're trying to do a shadow effect or something like that underneath another object. Something like that just like minimizes project load and everything else is super critical. And you don't know unless like the more time you spend with it, the more time you try learning it. And a lot of people don't even know all the integration between Adobe Story and Premiere. Like Adobe's really like I think
Adobe Story's their text support. So if you drop a script in there, like it'll actually do XML data attached to each of your clips and search the clips with voice recognition and then match it up to your script. So if you're doing a really long format, like feature-length film or something like that, it'll actually bundle your clips up into sections from the script if you have the script in Story before you move on to Premiere.
Right.
It's like it's a tool that no one even uses it. It's so freaking amazing.
Yeah. And it's little things like that they don't talk about because they move on to the new features like their morph cut tool, which I've used, which works great when there's an opportunity that can utilize it. And now all the I've been watching all the new stuff that they're coming out with soon. The thing in Audition where it'll remix a song to be an exact length. Things like that normally, you know, would take you an hour of cutting and splicing and beat matching. Now it does in seconds. It's like everyone's looking at that and they forget like some of the basic things that Adobe, you know, Audition and everything else can do that can just save you time in general, because everyone's looking at the new flashy effects. So it's just one of those that's like, there's no way to get around it, but, you know, to always try learning. And if that's what you want to do, you want to edit and stuff, is learning how to master your software, learning, you know, things like color, like the new color pane and all that kind of stuff. Everyone's all like staring at that. And I'm like, that's really great for people who don't know color, but there's also some stuff that you only learn if you're sitting there using a 3-wheel color corrector and curves and everything else as effects on your timeline, especially if you jump over into After Effects.
Get shot, man, if someone heard you saying you're doing color grading with curves. I've been yelled at multiple times for doing that.
Oh, well, you see, for me, it was always, it's because After Effects, that's how I started out. Like a quick tip, when I would try to color match 2 different objects, like say recorded with completely different cameras on a green screen or something like that, I would go like blue channel, red channel, green channel, and then I would go through curves and I would adjust the contrast of each of those curves so that it matches the rest of the image, because it'll be all black and white, so it'll be really easy to tell if the contrast is off. And then when I pop back to RGB, it's like perfectly color balanced to the other image, because you've gone through and made sure that it has as much green, as much red, and as much blue as anything else needs. So I grew up in effects, doing more After Effects than I did editing or color. So I learned how to use curves in lots of different ways, but you have to understand too, there's limitations to curves. There's, you know, curves doesn't really affect hues or saturation so much. So there's better ways to, you know, use that workflow. So as well as trying to do something like a color temperature shift is really difficult with curves, nearly impossible. So it's one of those things that, you know, the right tool for the right job, but that's why it's always good to experiment and try different things. And if you're interested in editing and all that kind of stuff, it's like, there's so much free information out there. You should be out there learning everything you can and trying everything you can. Because the cool part is unlike shooters, it's pretty easy for you to just sit in your room and download footage and play around and learn the software to your heart's content, where shooters kind of like need to go out and shoot something and find something to shoot. And, you know, if you won't have any experience shooting somebody riding a horse unless you go out and shoot somebody riding a horse. So, you know, or, you know, shooting out of a car or something like that. So
yeah, I definitely prefer the hands-on filming to the editing portion of my tasks most of the time. For editing, and sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but this is kind of an important thing for those of you that want to get deep into editing and aren't familiar with it or haven't done very much of it. I myself, I edit all the time, but I pay for a subscription to Udemy and to lynda.com. And this is not an advertisement for either one of those, but
if they'd like to sponsor us,
exactly. Bring on the cash. I would love a podcast sponsor for this show. But seriously, I pay for those subscriptions, and the reason I do is because every time they come out with a new version of CC, both of those, usually Udemy beats Lynda to the punch, but the lynda.com courses are a little bit more in depth and a little bit better. So whichever one, I think Udemy's cheaper. But the thing is when you go watch those, they skip over the simple stuff and they go right to the meat and potatoes of what's new in the product and cover as much as they can. And by watching those, like you probably only retain like 20 or 30%, but that 20 or 30% makes you that much better the next time you jump onto a project. And if you start using even like 3 of those features that you find out about and they become part of your regular tool base when you're editing, it will really speed up your time for getting your product out to your customer from the time it gets to your timeline. And there's a lot of different ways to do things, like Devin said, you know, especially in After Effects, but in Premiere as well. Like it's audio editing, bringing your stuff over to Audition, like knowing how to do that correctly, how to crossfade your audio into something else, or what type of transition to use between clips if you're trying to insert stock footage, how to grade and color correct that using the new color features. All those things are addressed in these classes. And I should go back and watch them 2 or 3 times, only watch them once, but definitely worth investing in if you are trying to get deep into editing and After Effects composite stuff.
Absolutely. And I mean, me personally, I should watch it more than once, but I usually just settle for taking notes. As weird as it sounds, I'll actually have a paper notebook and I'll write down notes as I watch it, and then I throw away the notebook. But something about writing it down and doing something tactile for my brain helps me to remember it and keep up with it.
All right, the last thing before we get out of here, and we went from a short show to a long show pretty fast. As always, Devin and I. I've got the Chromecast audio here, and this is kind of not related specifically to video editing, filmmaking, or anything, but it's super handy, guys. I have an old classic stereo. It's a 1931 Philco Tombstone radio, a big monstrous guy that I put new speakers in, have a nice power amp in. And for the longest time, I've been using Bluetooth to send audio from my phone or my laptop over to the stereo. And it sounds okay, but I didn't realize how bad it sounded until I got this Chromecast audio. If you're familiar with the Chromecast devices, their Chromecast is usually used to send a web screen over to your TV. So you have an HDMI input and then it's powered by a micro USB port. This is the same thing, only with audio only. And the audio quality for this is superb compared to the Bluetooth system I was using before. My stereo, while I was sort of disappointed in the quality, as soon as I started listening to it with this, I am much happier with the quality. It's $35. Definitely sounds good. This is my pick of the week, by the way. And Devin, you have another version of this, and there's some downfalls to this particular one.
Yeah,
man.
Well, it's one thing that you should include too for the audio purist per se is that it does include optical output.
Oh yes,
I haven't seen anyone use it yet. I haven't seen even an adapter for it. I imagine it's a basic 3.5 optical adapter like most people. But what I actually ended up getting, and it's a funny story about this. So this was on, I think, Indiegogo, and what I'm holding up is a giant, small black piece of plastic. And this is called a Joy drone or something like that. And I originally tried to get on Indiegogo. Something happened, like they failed funding or something like that. They moved over to Kickstarter and then got successful on that. And the day that this showed up is the day that Google had their I/O thing and they announced the Chromecast audio. I ended up getting one of those too because of promises of multi-room audio and everything else. But this guy sells for about $22. And what he does is he takes, it could be a modern Chromecast as well, but in this case, an old Chromecast, and you just plug it in. And then on the end of it, it's got a 3.5 millimeter, which you could do RCA or, auxiliary, whatever. You do a 3.5. So, and that's it. It doesn't require external power. For a while, for my stereo, I actually, unlike DJ, I was not a fan of Bluetooth just because I wanted to. We have.
Hey, now, I didn't say I was a fan of Bluetooth. That was just the only wireless choice I had seen.
Sure. We have part of the receiver goes to speakers that are out on the patio, and Bluetooth would never reach between the patio and where the stereo is located in the living room. So I needed a Wi-Fi option, and for a while I was using like a Wi-Fi radio that was DLNA, and then I was using DLNA adapter software on my Android device that would take Google Music and pump it out to DLNA, and then Google changed their Chromecasting format, so that wasn't allowed anymore. And so I ended up actually taking a Chromecast, plugging it into a VGA adapter, HDMI to VGA, in order to get analog audio out. To pump that into the stereo is a big mess. It required a power adapter, everything else. So I'm like, this is the answer to my prayers. This doesn't require any power. It just plugs in and it just works. It also works in the new Chromecast too. But what some people have mentioned is that there's certain compatibility that isn't available on Chromecast audio that's available for Chromecast. I think early on YouTube wasn't available, but I think they've changed that because YouTube is changing the way they're doing like music and its combination with Google Music. And I heard that Spotify Premium or Spotify non-premium doesn't work on Chromecast audio, but it does work on a normal Chromecast. So even though this adapter is like $22, I don't know. Part of me would be like, well, buy Spotify Premium, get rid of the ads anyways. But if you do have an old Chromecast lying around, you could upgrade it for $22 instead of spending $35 to turn it into, or buying a Chromecast audio device. To each their own. But anyways, I've used this guy for a while. He works great, as well as the Chromecast works. There's never a connectivity problem, and the audio actually sounds pretty great out of it because obviously they have to use some kind of DAC. But I've been impressed. The DAC in it's pretty good. So. I love it. I'm still waiting for the multi-room features to come out. I want to know if it'll work with ordinary Chromecasts that are plugged into TVs, because that would be brilliant, or if it's only going to work with the Chromecast audio adapters. And even if it does, still, I'm looking for cheap multi-room that doesn't cost me $1,000, aka Sonos. That's really what I want.
What would you do though with multi-room video cast? I mean, are you going to throw like a party and have like rave screens in every room that are flashing at the same rate, or what?
No, it's just because most rooms already have a Chromecast plugged into the TV, which by proxy is plugged into some kind of speaker system. So it would just be convenient because in my situation, I already have several Chromecasts plugged in around the house, as opposed to if it only does Chromecast audio, I got to get separate speakers or, use a different input on the speakers, and it becomes a bit more messy. So I'd like it to just be able to use your TV audio as well if that's available, but still, I'm waiting for this feature. They haven't announced like when they're going to come out. Just everyone's talking about they will eventually update it and they'll eventually have multi-room audio. And I wonder how well it'll sync and everything else. But for a long time, I've been using Logitech Media, whatever, with Raspberry Pis, which if you're really tech savvy is a really, fun way to spend 5 weekends of your life is setting, a multi-room audio up out of Raspberry Pis. But I want a simple, elegant solution that, when people come over, friends come over, anyone can use and do some multi-room audio. And I'm hoping that for Google, this is the answer because I cannot afford Sonos, and Sonos is the only easy-to-use multi-room audio system besides, those house systems where you use one receiver to drive an entire house.
Yeah, the other nice thing about the Chromecast audio is that it does have the Oh man, I just lost my train of thought. Well, I was going somewhere with that, and then no, I'm done. I don't have anything better to say about this. Great audio, good quality. Oh, I do remember one other thing though, and that is that they're including this in some speaker systems. So keep that in mind.
Oh yeah,
Want like because the two applications for me that the multicasting would be nice for is I know this is weird, but it'd be nice to have like a shower radio, one in the bathroom, and it'd be nice to have one in the kitchen because in the morning, like I'll get up and I'll cook breakfast for my wife or whatever, and like I'm going from room to room, and the stereo I have covers most of the house, but it doesn't really cover the kitchen or the bathroom. So if like I'm listening to something interesting and I want to like continue that on as podcasting goes into the shower, I can shower and then get over to the kitchen, make my breakfast and whatever. And
that's see, the weird part is that I've already nerded out on all this stuff you're talking about so hard because I already have like Bluetooth speakers that are connected to Android tablets that I've set up so that like when I turn the speaker on and it connects with the Android tablet, I use Tasker to automatically start feeding audio to that and start playing stuff that I want it to play. As well as I have a Amazon Alexa over there that I use for turning off lights and for playing music and everything else. So I'm already super connected with all that kind of stuff. I've already nerded out way hard. And that's why even somebody like me, who's very technical and knows, enough to make a Raspberry Pi multi-room monstrosity, I'm excited for Chromecast audio because if it can really deliver multi-room audio in a simple to use way that anyone can use it, then that's big for the WAF, the wife acceptance factor.
Now, one last thing on the Chromecast, and I did remember what dropped out of my brain. It was the fact that my stereo, the stereo that I'm using, the power amp, actually has a unloader that shuts it off when it doesn't sense an audio signal, when the signal basically goes to zero after a certain amount of time. And one of the things I have running into with this is that the unloader kicks on between songs. So you'll hear the relay click. Yeah, because it actually goes dead zero, like output on this guy, as opposed to leaving a little bit of audio noise, which most
most devices would. Like even your cell phone would still have a signal going out
to keep it going. Well, this drops out to almost basically no signal, and so the relay clicks to shut off the load to the speakers, and then it clicks again when the song starts. So if you don't have the smooth transition setting turned on for Spotify, like you every so often you get click, 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 click.
Right.
And it's between songs. It's sort of frustrating. So I'm gonna have to figure out some way to correct that.
You just override it, and then you move the entire power system over to like a remote control, like a Wemo or something like that. Because that's actually what I set up. Because I didn't want, of course, you don't want to leave your receiver on all day because it gets hot and you're gonna like burn it out. But when I sit on the patio, I have it all tied to one button on my phone for Tasker. One of these like flick buttons, which is a programmable button for Android and iOS devices. But I'll press one button and then it automatically turns on the stereo, and then it goes over to the Chromecast and starts telling the Chromecast audio what music to play and stuff like that. So that's how I deal with it, because my stereo is a Kenwood from 75 or something like that, 74. So it doesn't have any fancy relays to sit there and flip on and off.
Yeah, the next project is actually installing a full tube driver system in a Philco radio tombstone, and then open it up so that it's just glass. So you look into the tubes, and then the Chromecast audio will plug into the back of that, and so it'll be wireless with like also a very picturesque stereo. That's gonna be a grand to get done.
You
though,
audio
so,
nerd.
yeah.
You audio nerd.
All right. On that note, we've dove way off of the topic.
Yeah,
of
we already
video
were talking
production,
about
filmmaking.
cameras.
Devin, where can people
Podcast.
find you, man?
You can ask me about home automation questions at DevoCut on Twitter.
All right, guys, and you can find this podcast on SoundCloud, iTunes, so on and so forth. Devin did point out to me that apparently somehow our Pocket Cast, I think, has us down as DSLR Film Noob with an N. So I don't know how that happened. If anybody knows how to fix that, go for it, because I'm probably not going to chase that down. But thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Make sure you go subscribe, hit the like button, do all that kind of stuff, because that helps us. Maybe someday we can get lynda.com to sponsor our show.
Great.
And that note, thanks for listening to another exciting episode of DSLR Film Noob Podcast. Episode 60 was fun. Oh, Devin said I was really loud. Sorry about that, guys.
No, it's fine. Oh man. See, we should save the stupid home automation stuff for like the after show or something like that. Jeez, half of that podcast had nothing to do with filmmaking at all.
Wow. For those of you still watching the video, we did completely nerd out. Audio listeners don't get this part, but that was
sweet.
fun.
I just got a follower.
Oh, whoa. All
on
right.
Twitter.
We're going to end the video portion now while Devin revels over his follower.
Yes.